Norma Taggart had walked past that rusted iron gate at the far edge of her property 1,000 times without a second thought. To her neighbors, it led nowhere worth going. To the bank, it was just another forgotten detail on a property they were preparing to take from her. But when Edmund passed, he left behind exactly two things: a handwritten note sealed inside a yellowed envelope, and a key so old it had turned black with age. The note carried only 5 words: "Use it when you're ready." Standing there in the gray Kentucky morning, 67 years old and 3 weeks away from losing everything she had ever known, Norma finally decided she was ready. What she found on the other side of that gate didn't just save her farm. It revealed the secret life of a man she thought she had known completely, and it brought her to her knees. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The farmhouse had been in the Taggart family for 38 years, though it had never truly felt like just a house. It was a living, breathing record of everything Norma and Edmund had built together. The hand-painted trim on the window shutters that Edmund had redone every spring without fail, the wide front porch where they had spent more evenings than Norma could count, watching the sun go down over their 46 acres of eastern Kentucky land, and the kitchen table, solid oak, that Edmund had hauled home from an estate sale in 1989 and refinished himself over 3 long weekends. Every corner of that house carried his fingerprints, literally and otherwise. Now Norma sat at that kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in late February with an envelope from Harlan County Savings Bank lying open in front of her. She had read it 4 times already. She would have read it a 5th, but the words hadn't changed, and she suspected they weren't going to. 30 days, that was what she had left. 30 days before the bank would begin formal foreclosure proceedings on the property, the farmhouse, the outbuildings, the land, all of it. 30 days to come up with $163,000 she absolutely did not have. Norma was 67 years old. She had grown up the daughter of a tobacco farmer in neighboring Bell County, had married Edmund Taggart at 24, and had spent the 4 decades since building a life with him that was modest by most measures but rich in every way that actually mattered to her. They had raised 2 daughters, Carol and Ruth, both of whom now lived out of state with families of their own. They had grown burley tobacco, kept a small herd of cattle, and run a roadside produce stand every summer that had become something of a local institution. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was theirs. The trouble had started long before Edmund died. The tobacco buyout program had shifted everything in the mid-2000s, and like many small Kentucky farms, the Taggart operation had never quite found its footing again. They'd tried cattle, tried hay, tried diversifying into vegetables and herbs. Some years were better than others, but the debt had accumulated slowly and steadily, the way debt does when you're too busy surviving to notice it stacking up behind you. By the time Edmund was diagnosed with congestive heart failure 6 years ago, they were already carrying 2 loans against the property. Edmund had fought his illness the same way he fought everything, quietly, stubbornly, without complaint. He'd modified his workload but refused to stop entirely. Norma had found him more than once doing things the doctor had specifically told him not to do: fixing the fence line, hauling feed, wading through the backfield in rubber boots checking on drainage. Every time she'd scolded him, he'd given her that unhurried smile of his and said the same thing: "I've got things to finish, Norma. I'll rest when they're done." He had passed 14 months ago, on a quiet Thursday evening in October, with Norma holding his hand and the bedroom window open just enough to let in the smell of the autumn fields he had loved so much. He was 71 years old. The hospice nurse said it was peaceful. Norma supposed it was. Edmund had always managed to make hard things look peaceful. It was one of the qualities she had loved most about him and missed most acutely now. That steadiness, that unshakable sense that things would work out if you kept your hands busy and your faith intact. In the 14 months since his death, Norma had tried everything she could think of to save the farm. She had taken on part-time work at the feed co-op in town. She had sold off the remaining cattle. She had rented out the eastern pasture to a neighbor for grazing. She had applied for 2 agricultural assistance programs and been declined for both on technicalities that felt almost deliberately cruel. She had called the bank 4 times requesting extensions and had been granted 2 of them, which had felt like mercy at the time and felt now, with the foreclosure notice sitting on her table, like nothing more than a delay of the same painful ending. Her daughters had offered to help, and Norma had declined, gently but firmly both times. Carol and Ruth had their own mortgages, their own children, their own financial lives to manage. Norma was not going to become a burden on them. That was non-negotiable. What was also non-negotiable, or so she had believed until recently, was selling the farm. This land was Edmund. Selling it felt like losing him a second time, like handing over the last physical place in the world where she could still feel his presence in the soil and the fence posts and the particular way the morning light hit the barn in winter. She had resisted the idea with everything she had, but the bank's letter made resistance feel less like principle and more like delusion. Norma folded the letter carefully and set it beside her coffee mug. She looked out the kitchen window toward the back of the property. The land rolled gently toward a tree line, bare and gray in the February cold. And there, at the far edge of the yard where the grass gave way to a gravel path Edmund had laid himself sometime in the late 90s, stood the gate. It was iron, old, with ornamental scrollwork at the top that had once been beautiful and was now barely visible beneath layers of rust. A heavy padlock held it shut. Edmund had built the gate himself, Norma knew that much, sometime in the early years of their marriage. He'd told her it marked the boundary of a back section of the property that was overgrown and not worth worrying about. She had never had reason to question that. There had always been more than enough to worry about on the parts of the property that were worth something. She had found the key and the note the same way Martha, the same way so many women find the last things their husbands leave them, tucked into the back of a drawer she had been putting off opening. Edmund's bedside table. She had finally opened it 3 days ago, 14 months after his death, when she had run out of ways to keep avoiding it. The envelope had her name on it in Edmund's handwriting. Careful, deliberate, the same handwriting that had signed their marriage certificate and written her name on the front of every birthday card for 43 years. Inside was the key, black with age and surprisingly heavy for its size, and the note, 5 words on a plain index card. Use it when you're ready. Norma picked up her coffee mug, wrapped both hands around it, and looked at the gate for a long time. She thought about the foreclosure notice. She thought about Edmund's voice, that unhurried certainty he'd carried like something load-bearing. She thought about 30 days. Then she set down her mug, stood up from the kitchen table, and went to find her coat. The gravel path that led to the gate was overgrown on both sides, wild grass and brown winter weeds pressing in from the edges as if the land itself had been slowly trying to swallow the path whole. Norma walked it carefully, her boots crunching on the frost-stiffened ground, her breath coming out in small white clouds in the February cold. She had walked past this path countless times over the years without ever following it all the way to the end. There had always been something else demanding her attention. There always was on a working farm. Now she followed it to its end and stood in front of the gate. Up close it was more impressive than it looked from the kitchen window. The ironwork was heavy and deliberate, not something thrown together quickly. The scrollwork at the top, mostly obscured by rust, was intricate. Someone had put real thought into this gate, real craftsmanship. Norma ran her fingers along one of the vertical bars, feeling the rough texture of oxidized metal beneath her fingertips, and tried to remember if Edmund had ever mentioned building it. He had, once very early in their marriage. He'd called it a boundary marker, a way of defining what was theirs. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. She pulled the key from her coat pocket. It was heavier than she expected for something so small, solid, old, with a long cylindrical shaft and a simple 2-pronged bit at the end. She looked at it for a moment, thinking about Edmund's note. 5 words. He had never been a man who wasted language. If he said 5 words, those were the 5 words that mattered. Norma inserted the key into the padlock. It turned smoothly, not with the stiffness she'd expected from a lock that appeared to have been untouched for years, but cleanly, as if it had been oiled recently. The shackle released with a solid click. Norma removed the padlock, set it on the ground beside the gatepost, and pushed. The gate swung open quietly. Beyond it, the gravel path continued for another 30 feet before disappearing around a bend obscured by a stand of cedar trees. The cedars were dense and tall, easily 20 feet high, forming a natural wall on both sides of the path. Norma hadn't realized how tall they'd grown. From the house they just looked like a tree line. From here they looked like they were hiding something. She walked through the gate and followed the path around the bend. What she saw stopped her completely. The cedar trees gave way to a clearing, roughly 2 acres in size, and in that clearing was something that made no sense to her at first. Not because it was strange, but because it was beautiful, and she had not expected beauty here. Not in this forgotten back corner of their property that Edmund had always waved off as overgrown and not worth the trouble. The clearing held a structure, a building low and long, constructed from timber and stone with a metal roof that had weathered to a soft grey-green patina. It was well built, clearly, even from a distance. The lines were straight, the construction solid. Around it, even in the dead of February, she could see the organized evidence of intentional landscaping, stone pathways, raised beds framed in treated timber. A series of wooden structures she couldn't immediately identify, trellises perhaps, or frames of some kind, arranged in careful rows along the south-facing side of the building. Norma walked toward it slowly, the way you walk toward something you're not entirely sure is real. The building had 2 large windows on the south wall and a wide wooden door centered between them. The door had a simple iron handle, handmade, and above it, carved directly into a timber lintel, were 2 words, "For Norma." She stood in front of those 2 words for a long moment and felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for. It wasn't quite grief and it wasn't quite joy. It was something that existed in the space between the 2, the particular ache of being loved by someone who was no longer there to tell you so. Edmund had built this, all of this, in secret, on their own land, hidden behind those cedars, screened from the house and the road and every neighbor who had ever visited. He had built her something, and he had carved her name above the door, and he had never once told her it existed. Norma reached out and put her hand flat against the door. The wood was cold under her palm, smooth from weathering, solid as the man who had built it. She closed her eyes for just a moment. Then she pressed down on the iron handle and stepped inside. The interior of the building was dim at first, her eyes adjusting from the flat gray light outside to the softer darkness within. Then the details began to resolve themselves, one by one, and Norma felt her breath leave her body in a slow, quiet exhale that she couldn't have stopped if she tried. The space was a single large room, perhaps 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a high ceiling that followed the pitch of the metal roof. Along the south wall, beneath those 2 large windows, ran a long wooden workbench, clean and carefully organized. Above it, mounted on the timber wall, were rows of shelving holding glass jars, labeled in Edmund's handwriting, small tools arranged on hooks, notebooks lined up in a neat row. On the north wall, opposite the windows, were wooden racks, floor to ceiling, holding flat, shallow trays, dozens of them. Each tray held soil, dark and rich-looking even in the dim light. Each tray had a small handwritten label affixed to its front edge. Norma walked to the nearest rack and leaned in to read one of the labels. Panax quinquefolius, planted October 2009, rootstock grade A, documented. She read the next one. Panax quinquefolius, planted March 2011, rootstock grade A, documented. And the next. Panax quinquefolius, planted September 2013, rootstock grade A, documented. Norma straightened up and looked along the length of the rack. Every single tray carried the same botanical name. She didn't recognize it. She walked to the workbench and found a notebook, the topmost in the row, its cover labeled simply Volume 1. She opened it to the first page. Edmund's handwriting filled it from margin to margin, precise and unhurried as always. The date at the top of the first entry was June 14, 1997. 27 years ago. Norma had to sit down. There was a stool beside the workbench, and she lowered herself onto it without taking her eyes off the page. June 14, 1997. First planting today. 12 rootstock acquired from a grower in Harlan County through Tom Briggs at the co-op. Panax quinquefolius, American ginseng, wild simulated method. This is going to take patience. More patience than most people have. 5 to 10 years before first harvest is realistic. But Norma always says I'm the most patient man she's ever met. I suppose we'll find out if she's right. The back clearing is perfect for this. North-facing slope, hardwood canopy, well-drained soil. Conditions are ideal. Nobody goes back there. Nobody will know. Norma read the entry 3 times. American ginseng. She knew the name vaguely. It grew wild in Kentucky, she knew that much. People hunted it in the woods sometimes. She had a memory of her father mentioning it once when she was a girl, something about it being valuable. But she had no idea what it was actually worth, or why Edmund would have spent 27 years cultivating it in secret on the back corner of their property. She kept reading. The notebook covered the first 5 years of the operation in meticulous detail. Every planting, every soil amendment, every adjustment to the growing conditions. Edmund had researched everything, that much was clear. He cited sources, noted conversations with botanists and agricultural extension agents, referenced price guides and market reports. He had not stumbled into this. He had planned it with the same quiet, methodical thoroughness he brought to everything he did. A second notebook picked up where the first left off. Then a third, then a fourth. Norma pulled them from the shelf one by one and read through them in the cold stillness of the building, her coat still on, her breath still visible in the air. As the notebooks progressed through the years, the operation grew. More plantings, more trays, more rootstock. Edmund had harvested carefully and selectively, never taking more than the crop could sustain, always replanting, always documenting. He had sold small quantities through a broker in Lexington under a business name Norma had never heard. She found the records in the fifth notebook. The amounts were modest, a few $1,000s here and there, money that had apparently gone back into the operation itself. He hadn't been drawing income from it. He had been growing it. At the back of the sixth and most recent notebook, she found a folded piece of paper tucked between the last 2 pages. She unfolded it with hands that were no longer entirely steady. It was a letter. Edmund's handwriting, her name at the top. Norma, if you've made it this far, then you've opened the gate and you've found what I built for you. I'm so proud of you for finding your way here. I know it wasn't easy. I know the last year, or however long it's been, has been harder than anything I ever wanted for you. I'm sorry I'm not there. I'm sorry I left you with so much to carry. But I did not leave you empty-handed. Keep reading. I'll explain everything. Norma pressed the letter flat against her chest and looked up at the ceiling of the building Edmund had built for her in secret over the course of 27 years. Outside, the February wind moved through the cedar trees with a sound like breathing. Norma sat on that stool for a long time before she could bring herself to keep reading. The cold had settled into her bones, but she barely noticed it. She was somewhere else entirely, moving backward through 27 years of a secret she had never suspected, replaying memories of Edmund through this new lens and finding that everything looked different now. All those evenings he had come in late from the back of the property, boots muddy, smelling of earth and cedar. All those trips to Lexington he had chalked up to equipment parts or feed supply runs. All those quiet hours she had assumed he was simply walking the land the way he always did, the way farmers do when they need to think. He had not been walking, he had been working. She unfolded his letter again and continued reading. I started this in 1997 because I was scared. The tobacco program was already showing cracks, and I could see where things were heading for small farms like ours. I didn't know what to do about it, but I knew I had to do something. Tom Briggs at the co-op mentioned ginseng to me almost as a joke, said there were old-timers in the hills who made good money off it. I went home and spent 3 weeks reading everything I could find. What I found changed my thinking entirely. American ginseng, Norma, wild simulated ginseng, grown properly with good documentation and clean provenance, is one of the most valuable agricultural products in the world. The Asian market pays extraordinary prices for authenticated American ginseng root, particularly aged root from Appalachian region soil. I found price records going back decades. I talked to a broker in Lexington named Curtis Doyle who handled certified ginseng exports. He told me that a pound of properly documented, aged, wild simulated ginseng root from Kentucky could fetch anywhere from $500 to $1,000 at the time. He said the prices were only going up. That was in 1997, Norma. The prices have gone up. Norma lowered the letter for a moment and looked at the racks of trays along the north wall. Dozens of them, each one carefully labeled, carefully tended, carefully documented over the course of more than 2 decades. She thought about the math and felt something shift in her chest. She kept reading. I have been harvesting selectively since 2007, selling small quantities through Curtis to keep the operation self-funding and to establish a market relationship, but I have been holding back the majority of the rootstock, particularly the oldest and largest roots, because I knew that aged ginseng root commands the highest prices. The roots I have not harvested are now between 15 and 27 years old. In the ginseng market, that is exceptional. That is rare. That is worth waiting for. In the folder on the workbench, behind the notebooks, you will find a current market assessment that Curtis prepared for me 8 months ago. Read it carefully, then call Curtis. His number is on the front of the folder. He knows about you. He knows this day might come. He is a good man, and he will help you. Do not let anyone pressure you into selling quickly or cheaply. The people who will try to take advantage of you will count on you not knowing what you have. Now you know. Don't let them. I love you more than this letter can hold. Everything in that building is yours. Everything I built back there, every hour I spent in that cold and that heat and that mud, I was thinking of you, making sure you would be okay. Making sure that if I went first, and I always knew I might, you would not lose what we built together. You are stronger than you know, Norma. You always have been. I just wanted to make sure you had something solid to stand on while you proved it. All my love, always. Edmund. Norma sat with the letter in her hands until she became aware that she was crying, not the controlled private tears she had allowed herself in the 14 months since Edmund's death, but something deeper and more complete. She let it come. There was no one to be composed for out here. In this building Edmund had raised for her in secret, behind a gate he had locked until she was ready. When it passed, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and stood up. She found the folder behind the notebooks exactly where Edmund had said it would be. It was thick, organized in the same methodical way as everything else he had built here. Behind the first tab was a typewritten document on the letterhead of a Lexington agricultural brokerage firm. At the top of the first page, underlined, was a figure. Estimated current market value of documented rootstock holdings, Taggart Property, Powell County, Kentucky. Norma read the number. Then she sat back down on the stool, pressed both hands flat on the workbench, and lowered her head. The number on the page was $1,400,000. Norma read it 3 times, the way she had read the foreclosure notice 3 times, except that this time the words were not taking something from her. They were giving something back. $1,400,000. That was the estimated current market value of the ginseng rootstock Edmund had been cultivating, documenting, and protecting on the back corner of their property for 27 years. The broker's assessment was detailed and methodical, broken down by age class, root grade, and projected export pricing based on current Asian market demand. Curtis Doyle had done his work carefully. The numbers were conservative, he noted in his conclusion, and could run higher depending on buyer interest and auction conditions. Norma set the document down on the workbench and looked at it for a long time without moving. Then she picked up the folder and began reading everything else inside it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Edmund had documented everything with the same obsessive thoroughness that men who love their wives beyond reason tend to bring to the things they build in secret. There were planting records going back to the very first rootstock purchased in 1997. There were soil analysis reports, harvesting logs, chain of custody documents for every sale he had made through Curtis Doyle's brokerage. There were photographs, hundreds of them, organized chronologically in labeled envelopes, showing the clearing and the building and the growing operation at every stage of its development. There were correspondence letters between Edmund and Curtis, between Edmund and a botanist at the University of Kentucky who had apparently consulted on the wild simulated growing method, between Edmund and 2 separate ginseng certification bodies whose stamps of authentication appeared on official documents near the back of the folder. This was not a hobby. This was a carefully constructed, professionally documented, legitimate agricultural enterprise that Edmund had been running quietly in the background of their lives for nearly 3 decades. While Norma had worried about tobacco prices and cattle markets and loan payments, Edmund had been building her a safety net so thoroughly engineered that it could hold the weight of everything they stood to lose. She found a notebook she had missed earlier, smaller than the others, tucked flat beneath the folder. On its cover, in Edmund's handwriting, were the words "For reference, read before you call Curtis." She opened it. Inside, Edmund had written what amounted to a guide. A plain language explanation of the ginseng market, how pricing worked, what buyers looked for, what documentation was required for export certification, what a fair offer looked like, and what a low one looked like. He had written it for her, written it imagining exactly this moment, her sitting in this building, cold and overwhelmed, trying to understand something she had never had reason to know anything about. He had tried to prepare her for every question she might have before she even knew to ask it. One section was titled "People Who Will Try to Cheat You." Norma almost smiled at that. Edmund had always been direct. There will be people who find out about this and try to buy it cheaply before you understand what it is worth. They will use your grief and your financial situation as leverage. They will tell you the rootstock is worth far less than it is. They will invent problems with the documentation or the certification. They will create urgency where none exists. Do not believe them. Do not sell to anyone who comes to you unsolicited. Work only with Curtis or with an established broker he recommends. The documentation is complete and the certification is clean. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying to you. Norma closed the notebook and sat quietly for a moment. Then she pulled out her phone, opened the folder to the front page where Curtis Doyle's number was written in Edmund's hand, and dialed. The phone rang 4 times before a man answered. His voice was warm and unhurried, a Kentucky voice, the kind that didn't rush itself. Curtis Doyle speaking. "Mr. Doyle," Norma said. "My name is Norma Taggart, Edmund Taggart's wife." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, and then Curtis Doyle exhaled slowly. "Mrs. Taggart, I've been hoping you'd call. I'm so sorry about Edmund. He was one of the finest men I ever did business with. Thank you." Norma steadied her voice. "I'm sitting in the building he built on our property. I've read the assessment you prepared. I need your help understanding what to do next." "Then you've come to the right place," Curtis said. "And I want you to know something before we go any further. Edmund told me about your situation. The farm, the debt, the timeline. He made me promise that if you ever called, I would treat you exactly the way I treated him. Fairly, carefully, and without rushing you into anything." Norma closed her eyes briefly. "That's all I needed to hear," she said. Curtis Doyle arrived 2 days later in a mud-spattered pickup truck that looked exactly right parked in a Kentucky farmyard. He was a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, with a weathered face and the unhurried manner of someone who had spent his life working with the land and the people who lived on it. He shook Norma's hand at the door with a firm, uncomplicated grip and followed her across the frost-hardened ground toward the back of the property without small talk, which she appreciated. When they rounded the bend in the cedar-lined path and the clearing came into view, Curtis stopped walking the same way Norma had stopped 2 days earlier. He stood there for a moment, hands in his jacket pockets, taking it in. "Edmund built all of this himself," Norma said. Curtis shook his head slowly. "I knew he was serious about this operation. I didn't know he'd built a proper facility." He walked toward the building, studying the construction with an appraising eye. "This is solid work. Timber framing, good roof pitch for drainage, south-facing windows for light management." He knew exactly what he was doing. "He spent 27 years on it," Norma said quietly. Curtis looked at her with an expression she recognized. It was the look people got when they encountered a love story they hadn't been prepared for. "I know," he said. "He told me once that every hour he put into this place was an hour he was putting into you." Said it without any embarrassment about it either. That was Edmund. They went inside. Curtis moved through the building methodically, examining the rootstock trays with a practiced eye, reviewing the documentation folder, cross-referencing Edmund's notebooks with the certification records. He worked quietly and thoroughly, and Norma sat on the stool by the workbench and let him work, understanding that this was what Edmund had wanted, this careful, unhurried assessment by a man who could be trusted to tell the truth about what was here. After nearly 2 hours, Curtis straightened up from the last rack of trays and turned to face her. "Mrs. Taggart," he said, "this is the finest wild simulated ginseng operation I have seen in 30 years of this business. The rootstock is exceptional. The oldest roots are showing the kind of age and conformation that the export market pays top prices for. And the documentation," he held up the folder, "is complete. Every root traceable, every planting recorded, every certification current. Edmund did everything right." "What is it actually worth?" Norma asked. "Not the estimate, your honest opinion." Curtis considered for a moment. "The assessment I prepared 8 months ago put it at $1.4 million on the conservative end. Prices have moved since then. Export demand from South Korea and China is stronger than it was. Honestly, Mrs. Taggart, at the right auction with the right buyers, you could see $1.6 million, possibly more." Norma absorbed that in silence. She didn't have long to absorb it. The following morning, Vincent Hale pulled into her driveway in a black sedan. He was the senior loan officer at Harlan County Savings who had handled their account for the past decade, a neat, careful man in his late 40s who had always been polite to Norma in the way that people are polite when they hold leverage over you. He got out of the car smoothly, adjusted his jacket, and smiled the smile of someone who had rehearsed it. "Mrs. Taggart, I hope I'm not intruding. I was in the area and wanted to check in personally. See how you're holding up." Norma stood on the porch with her arms folded. She had not invited him, and she had not unlocked the gate that morning, which meant whatever he had seen or heard, it had not come from looking directly at Edmund's building. "That's thoughtful of you," she said, in a tone that indicated she did not find it thoughtful at all. Vincent's eyes moved briefly toward the back of the property before returning to her face. "I heard you've had some activity back there on the property. A visitor from Lexington." He kept his voice easy, conversational. "I only mention it because if you have assets you're looking to liquidate, the bank has resources to facilitate that kind of transaction. We could potentially work something out that would benefit everyone involved." Norma looked at him steadily. "What kind of something?" "Well, if there's equipment or agricultural product back there with some value, we might be able to arrange an accelerated appraisal and apply it directly against your debt. Keep things simple, keep things in-house." Norma understood exactly what he was offering. A fast, quiet transaction that would benefit the bank and whoever Vincent had already spoken to about what might be on the back of her property. She had read Edmund's notebook. She knew what this looked like. "Mr. Hale," she said, "I appreciate you stopping by, but my affairs are being handled. You'll be hearing from me before your 30-day deadline. Good morning." She went back inside before he could respond and locked the front door behind her. Then she called Curtis Doyle and told him they needed to move. Curtis moved quickly once Norma gave him the word. Within 48 hours he had contacted 3 serious buyers from his established network, 2 export brokers with direct connections to South Korean and Chinese markets, and 1 domestic collector and botanical preservationist based in Nashville named Dr. Amara Osei, who Curtis described as the most knowledgeable person in North America on authenticated Appalachian ginseng provenance. All 3 had expressed immediate and serious interest upon receiving the documentation package Curtis prepared from Edmund's records. Dr. Osei arrived first, driving up from Nashville on a Thursday morning in a silver SUV loaded with equipment cases. She was a tall woman in her mid-50s, with close-cropped natural hair and the focused, unhurried energy of someone who had spent decades becoming the best in her field and no longer needed to prove it to anyone. She shook Norma's hand at the door and looked her directly in the eye. "Mrs. Taggart, Curtis tells me your husband spent 27 years building something extraordinary. I'd very much like to see it." Norma led her down the gravel path and through the gate, which she had begun leaving unlocked during the day. Something about locking it again felt wrong now, like closing a door that Edmund had finally opened for her. When Dr. Osei stepped into the clearing and saw the building, she paused exactly the way Curtis had paused, the way Norma herself had paused. Then she walked forward without a word and placed both hands flat against the timber wall, the way a person touches something they recognize as significant. Inside, she worked for 3 hours. She examined rootstock individually, pulling samples from trays with gloved hands and studying them with a magnification loupe, measuring, photographing, cross-referencing against Edmund's documentation with meticulous attention. She asked Norma questions throughout, quiet and specific, about Edmund's background, his methods, his sourcing. Norma answered everything she could and admitted freely what she didn't know, which Dr. Osei seemed to appreciate. Finally, she sat down across from Norma at the workbench and folded her hands. "Mrs. Taggart," she said, "I want to tell you something before I give you my professional assessment. I have evaluated ginseng operations across 7 states over the course of 22 years. I have seen operations with more acreage and more volume than this one. I have never seen one with this level of documentation integrity and rootstock quality combined. What your husband built here is not just valuable, it is, from a botanical heritage standpoint, genuinely rare." "What would your institution offer?" Norma asked. Dr. Osei's organization, the Appalachian Botanical Heritage Foundation, was a Nashville-based nonprofit dedicated to preserving and promoting authentic Appalachian agricultural traditions. They had acquisition funds specifically for significant operations like Edmund's, and they had established relationships with certified export partners that consistently achieved above-market pricing for authenticated rootstock. "Our foundation would purchase the documented rootstock and assume management of the operation going forward," Dr. Osei said. "We would harvest and export through our certified partners, which typically yields between 15 and 20% above standard broker pricing. Based on Curtis's assessment and what I've seen today, I would recommend our board approve an acquisition offer of $1.5 million. That is a firm number, not a starting point for negotiation. It reflects what this is genuinely worth. Norma sat with that number for a moment. Then she told Dr. O'Shea about Vincent Hale's visit, about the way his eyes had moved toward the back of the property, about his offer to keep things simple and in-house. Dr. O'Shea's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes sharpened. "That is a pattern I have seen before," she said. "People in financial leverage positions who learn about agricultural assets and attempt to insert themselves into the transaction. It is predatory and it is unfortunately common." "Has he made any formal move against the property?" "Not yet. I have 21 days remaining on the foreclosure notice." "Then we have time to do this correctly." Dr. O'Shea opened her bag and produced a business card and a one-page letter of intent. "This is a formal expression of our offer. It is not legally binding on either side, but it establishes in writing that you have a legitimate offer at fair market value. If anyone attempts to pressure you before the transaction closes, this document is your protection." 2 days later, Roland Fitch appeared at Norma's door. He was a heavy-set man in his early 70s with expensive boots and the particular confidence of someone who had bought things cheaply from desperate people, often enough to consider it a skill. He had driven up from Knoxville, he said, having heard through mutual contacts in the agricultural community that there might be some ginseng rootstock available on a distressed property in Powell County. Norma looked at him through the screen door. "I have no idea who gave you that information," she said, "but I am not a distressed property, Mr. Fitch. I am a woman with a lawyer, a signed letter of intent, and 21 days to close a transaction that does not involve you. Good afternoon." She closed the door and went to call Bet Sumner next door, because after everything that had happened in the past week, she needed to talk to a friend. Bet Sumner arrived within 20 minutes of Norma's call, the way good neighbors do when they understand that what's being asked for isn't help with a task, but help with the weight of a moment. She sat across from Norma at the oak kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee between them and listened without interrupting while Norma told her everything. The gate, the building, the ginseng, Edmund's notebooks, Curtis, Dr. O'Shea, Vincent Hale, Roland Fitch, all of it. When Norma finished, Bet sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "Edmund Taggart was the most quietly extraordinary man I ever knew." Norma wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "He never said a word, Bet. 27 years. I never had the slightest idea. That's because he was doing it for you, not for credit." Bet shook her head slowly. "Some men love loudly. Edmund loved like he built things. Solid, patient, built to last." Norma looked out the kitchen window toward the cedar tree line. The gate was visible from here, just barely, its iron scrollwork catching the thin afternoon light. She had walked past it for decades without knowing what it held, without knowing that on the other side of it, her husband had been quietly, methodically, lovingly building her future one season at a time. Bet reached across the table and covered Norma's hand with her own. "What are you going to do now?" Norma considered the question seriously, the way Edmund had always taught her to consider serious questions, not rushing toward the first answer but letting the real one surface at its own pace. "I'm going to do this right," she said finally, "for him." She signed the acquisition agreement with Dr. O'Shea's foundation the following Tuesday, with a lawyer present, in the kitchen where Edmund had eaten breakfast every morning for 38 years. The agreed price was $1.5 million. The foundation would take possession of the rootstock and ongoing operation, harvest and export through their certified partners, and maintain the building Edmund had constructed as part of the operational site. Dr. O'Shea had also proposed, and Norma had accepted, that the foundation would create a formal documentation exhibit about Edmund's operation, recognizing it as a landmark example of wild simulated ginseng cultivation in Appalachian Kentucky. Edmund's name would be on it. His notebooks, his photographs, his 27 years of careful records, his story would be preserved and told by people who understood exactly what it represented. When Dr. O'Shea had told her that, Norma had needed a moment before she could respond. She had thought about Edmund in that building alone, season after season, year after year, writing everything down in his careful handwriting, never once imagining that strangers in Nashville would one day read those notebooks and understand exactly what kind of man had written them. "He deserved to be known," Norma had told Dr. O'Shea. "He will be," Dr. O'Shea had replied simply. The following Monday morning, Norma walked into Harlan County Savings Bank and handed Vincent Hale a cashier's check for $163,000. She watched his face carefully as he read the amount and understood where it had come from. He recovered quickly, the way practiced men do, but not quickly enough. "This settles the debt in full," Norma said. "I trust the foreclosure proceedings will be cancelled immediately." "Of course," Vincent said in the careful tone of a man recalibrating. "Mrs. Taggart, I want you to know that the bank always had your best interests at heart." Norma looked at him for a moment without expression. "I know exactly what the bank had at heart, Mr. Hale," she said pleasantly. "Good day." She walked out into the February sunlight and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing cold Kentucky air, and felt something she hadn't felt in 14 months. Not relief exactly, though that was part of it. Something more complete than relief. The particular wholeness that comes from honoring a promise made by someone you loved. She sat in her car for a few minutes before driving home, not because she needed to collect herself, but because she wanted to hold the moment a little longer. Wanted to let it settle fully before the next thing began. Edmund had always said that people moved past good moments too quickly, always rushing toward what came next before they'd fully inhabited what was happening right now. She was trying to do better at that. She was trying, in general, to do the things Edmund had been gently nudging her toward their entire marriage, now that she finally had the space and the means and the permission he had written into every letter and every notebook page. She drove home through the Kentucky hills with the window down despite the cold. The weeks that followed moved differently than any weeks had moved since Edmund's death. There was still grief, there would always be grief, but it had found a different shape, less like a wall she kept walking into, and more like weather. Present and real, but something you could move through rather than something that stopped you entirely. Norma thought that was probably what healing actually looked like, not the absence of loss, but the gradual return of your own ability to keep moving while carrying it. She called her daughters Carol and Ruth the evening after signing the acquisition agreement. She had not told them about the building or the ginseng or any of it while the transaction was still in progress, not wanting to raise hopes that might complicate, not wanting to involve them in something she needed to handle herself. But now it was done, and they deserved to know. Carol was silent for so long after Norma finished explaining that Norma checked twice to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Dad did all of that," Carol finally said. "For 27 years, and never told anyone." "Not a soul," Norma confirmed. Another silence. Then Carol said, in a voice that had gone quiet and careful the way her father's voice used to go quiet and careful when something mattered, "I always knew he loved you more than most people know how to love anybody. But I didn't know he loved you like that." Ruth cried, which was not surprising. Ruth had always cried easily and without embarrassment, a quality Edmund had always said he admired in her. Norma let her cry and didn't try to hurry her out of it. Both daughters offered to come home. Norma told them she was all right, and meant it in a way she hadn't meant it the other times she'd said it over the past 14 months. She told them to come in the spring when the hills were green, and they both said they would. 2 months later, on an April morning when the Kentucky hills had gone the specific shade of green that only exists for about 3 weeks each spring, Norma stood in Edmund's building with the south-facing windows propped open and a wide wooden table set up in the center of the room. On the table were paints, brushes, and a canvas. She had taken the first of what would become weekly painting classes in town, taught by a retired art teacher named Gloria Fitch, no relation to Roland, who had told Norma after her first session that she had a natural feeling for color that couldn't be taught and shouldn't be wasted. Edmund had known that. He'd written it in the letter meant for her first birthday after finding the building. "You always saw color differently than anyone I knew, Norma. You'd describe a sunset and I'd look at the same sky and wonder how you found all that in it. That's a gift. Use it." She was using it. Bet Sumner's son James, who worked in landscape design in Lexington, had come out to help Norma plan a garden for the clearing around the building. Not a production garden, not a functional one, just a beautiful one. Flowers and native plantings and a stone path that curved around the building's south wall and ended at a simple wooden bench facing the tree line. Norma had chosen every plant herself, guided by James's knowledge and her own instinct for color and shape that she was only now, at 67, giving herself permission to fully trust. On the workbench where Edmund had written his notebooks and organized his records, Norma had placed a small framed card. She had written it herself, in her own handwriting, the night after she signed the acquisition agreement. It said simply, "He worked here for 27 years so that I could work here for the rest of mine." On the wall above the preserved workbench she had hung 2 things. A framed photograph of Edmund standing in this clearing in the summer of 2003, squinting into the sun with his hands on his hips and that expression he always wore when something he'd built was going right. And beside it, a small painted canvas, the first thing she had completed. It showed the rusted iron gate, swung open, with Kentucky morning light coming through it in long golden bars. She had titled it simply, "He Always Knew." The painting had already been requested for inclusion in the Appalachian Botanical Heritage Foundation's exhibit on Edmund's operation. Dr. Osei had seen a photograph of it and called Norma personally to ask if it could hang alongside Edmund's notebooks and documentation as part of the permanent display. Norma had said yes without hesitation. It felt right. Edmund's work and her response to it, side by side, the way they had always been side by side, even when she hadn't known exactly what he was working on. She had also quietly and without announcing it to anyone except Bet, established a small fund she called the Open Gate Fund. It wasn't large, not a formal charity, not yet, just an account she had set aside $50,000 into with the intention of helping neighboring farm families in Powell County who were facing the kind of financial pressure she had faced. She had already helped 2 families with overdue property tax payments that would have triggered foreclosure proceedings. She had done it anonymously both times, through Curtis Doyle, who had agreed to act as intermediary, and she intended to keep doing it for as long as she was able. Edmund had spent 27 years doing something good in secret. She figured she could manage at least a few years of the same. Norma picked up her brush, looked at the blank canvas in front of her, and began. Outside, through the open windows, the April wind moved through the cedar trees Edmund had planted to protect his secret, and the gate at the end of the gravel path stood open in the morning light, the way it would from now on. The farm stretched beyond it, green and alive, theirs still, hers now, held together by the love of a man who had understood that the truest way to take care of someone was to keep working for them even when they couldn't see you doing it. Norma painted, and the morning came fully into the room, and somewhere in the way the light fell across the canvas she was just beginning, she could almost feel Edmund standing behind her, quiet and unhurried, watching her work the way she had never known she was watching him. He always knew. And now, finally, so did she. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.